Welcome back to the deep dive.
Hmm.
We're going deep on intelligence this time, but with a bit of a twist. We're looking at what happens when intelligence fails.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. You sent over this academic article and some background on the author, Carlos Alberto Ardila Castro.
Okay.
He's a military expert, and he's really spent his career trying to get a grip on intelligence and strategic thinking.
Makes sense.
So today, our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to understand why these intelligence failures happen
Okay.
and how they lead to those like, oh no moments, those big surprises, what the experts call strategic surprises.
Yeah.
And probably the most important thing is figuring out what we can do to prevent them from happening in the first place.
I mean, it's easy to think of intelligence agencies as these like all-seeing, all-knowing organizations,
Right.
but the reality is so much more complicated.
Yeah.
So I think this deep dive is really going to take us through some of the common traps that can lead to those failures
Right.
and look at the consequences that come with them, especially when we're talking about strategic surprises.
Yeah.
Those events that kind of come out of nowhere,
Yeah.
and just change the whole game.
Exactly. The article actually, it points out that a lot of people, especially the ones making the big decisions, they have this idea that intelligence is basically foolproof.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's almost like assuming that just because, we have intelligence agencies, we're somehow immune to being caught off guard.
Right. And that assumption, as Ardila Castro argues, that can be a really dangerous one. I
Yeah.
mean, just look at what happened in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example. These strategic surprises keep happening throughout history, and both sides in that conflict, they were working with incomplete or just plain faulty intelligence,
Right.
which has led to, significant losses, and it's just dragging on and on.
It is. So how do we even end up in these situations where intelligence fails? Like,
Yeah.
how does that happen?
Well, the article breaks down the decision-making process, and it kind of highlights three major areas where things can go wrong.
Okay.
One is methodological limitations.
Okay.
Another is cognitive biases.
Right.
And then lastly, this lack of trust between the decision makers and the intelligence professionals that are providing the information.
I see. Yeah.
So if we look at the first one, methodological limitations, it's all about like how we're framing the problem at the very beginning.
Okay.
Are we even asking the right questions to start with?
Right.
Are we using the right tools to gather the information and analyze it?
I see.
And then you've got cognitive biases, which are those mental shortcuts that we all use,
Yeah.
but they can lead to assumptions that are just wrong.
Right.
And even misinterpretations of what we're seeing. A really common example is confirmation bias.
Yeah. Right.
We tend to, look for information that backs up what we already believe,
Right.
even if it doesn't give us the whole picture.
It's like those social media algorithms, right? Where they just keep feeding you the same kind of content,
Exactly.
reinforcing your worldview.
Exactly. And then the final piece is trust. If you've got this lack of trust between the people making decisions and the intelligence professionals, it just creates a bottleneck.
Yeah.
The information can't flow. It leads to people being skeptical of those findings, especially when the findings challenge their deeply held beliefs.
That makes sense. I mean, if you already distrust the person or the organization giving you the information, you're much more likely to just dismiss it out of hand, no
Absolutely.
matter how valid it is.
Absolutely. And to combat this, Ardila Castro says we need to build stronger early warning systems.
What would that look like, though? These stronger early warning systems?
Well, imagine instead of an intelligence agency being like a library, just reacting to requests for information, it's more like a tech startup.
Oh, okay.
Constantly adapting, not afraid to just toss out what's not working.
Right.
And Ardila Castro suggests we need to encourage creative thinking
Okay.
and constantly question those organizational paradigms that just lead to stagnation and blind spots.
So creating a culture of, okay, let's challenge our assumptions, let's be open to new ways of doing things, rather than just sticking with the status quo because that's how it's always been done.
Precisely. It's about constantly learning, being willing to adapt, unlearning what we think we know, and making sure there's a really strong feedback loop between the people who are creating intelligence and the people who are using it
Right.
to make sure the information being gathered is actually useful and actionable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense
Yeah.
because if the information isn't useful to the decision makers, it doesn't matter how accurate it is.
Exactly. And this ties directly into another critical point Ardila Castro makes. We need realistic expectations on both sides.
Okay.
The intelligence professionals have got to be honest about what they don't know.
Yeah.
And the decision makers need to understand that intelligence, it's not a crystal ball.
Right.
It's not about predicting the future perfectly.
Right.
It's about providing the best assessment that you can based on what's available at the time.
Right. But hold on a sec. If intelligence can be misused so easily, how do we stop it from becoming a political tool? You know?
Well, if we think about the bigger picture, that misalignment of expectations, it can lead to intelligence being twisted to support political agendas,
Yeah.
which further erodes trust and just makes the whole system less effective.
So we've got this like really complex mix of things that can contribute to intelligence failures then?
Right.
We've got those methodological limitations, cognitive biases, lack of trust, unrealistic expectations, and even the potential for political manipulation.
Yeah.
It sounds like there are a lot of ways things can go wrong.
There are a lot of moving pieces. And that's exactly why understanding these potential pitfalls is so important. And that's precisely why understanding those potential pitfalls is so crucial. You know, before we were talking about the need for a more robust and a more resilient intelligence system, and Ardila Castro, he has this fascinating concept that he calls unlearning.
Unlearning.
And it plays a really big role in how we can try to combat these failures.
Unlearning. That sounds
Ugh.
kind of backward.
Yeah.
Like, are we trying to forget what we know?
I get why it might seem that way at first.
Yeah.
But it's really about recognizing that the world is always changing. It's in constant flux.
Right.
And our understanding of it has to keep up. So what Ardila Castro is saying is that intelligence agencies, just like, you know, any large organization, they can get stuck in their ways.
Yeah, that's true.
They cling to these outdated methods and assumptions that might have worked in the past but aren't so effective anymore.
So it's about shaking up those paradigms that just lead to stagnation and blind spots. The ones that, you know, they stop us from seeing the whole picture.
It's about being willing to let go of old ways of thinking, even if those new approaches, even if they challenge those long-held beliefs.
That's got to be tough, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's human nature to just stick with what we know,
It absolutely is.
even if it's not working anymore.
And that's exactly why Ardila Castro puts so much emphasis on building a culture of constantly learning and being willing to adapt within these organizations.
Okay, so it's about creating an environment where people are not just allowed, but encouraged to experiment and take risks, learn from their mistakes.
Yeah.
So moving away from this culture of blame and punishment,
Right.
and more toward a culture of curiosity and just continuous improvement.
Exactly. And that takes strong leadership, too.
Oh, yeah.
Leaders who are willing to embrace change themselves,
Right.
and empower their teams to do the same.
Yeah. Now, he also talks about early warning systems and how intelligence agencies need to develop more robust ones. So what does that look like? I mean, in practice, what does that mean?
Well, think of them like the smoke detectors you have in your house.
Okay.
They're designed to pick up on those signals that something might be wrong
Okay.
before it actually turns into a fire.
Right.
It's about gathering information from a lot of different sources, looking for trends and patterns, and then developing scenarios like, okay, how might this actually play out?
So you're kind of connecting the dots before they even form a complete picture,
Yeah.
trying to anticipate those problems before they explode into like full-blown crisis.
You got it. And to do that effectively, you need a deep understanding of what's happening in the world.
Right.
The politics, who the players are, where those points of tension are, but it also requires, the ability to think critically and creatively
Yeah.
about how all those factors interact and could, create future problems.
So we're talking about moving away from just reacting to things to a more proactive approach to intelligence.
Exactly. It's about, not just responding to events after they've already happened,
Right.
but getting ahead of the curve, trying to anticipate and mitigate those threats before they even get started.
That sounds great in theory, but is there a danger that, we become so focused on these future threats that we lose sight of what's going on right now?
That's a really valid point, and it's why finding that balance is key. These early warning systems, they shouldn't replace the traditional intelligence gathering and analysis. They should make it better.
Okay, so enhance it, not replace it.
Right. It's like driving a car, You need to keep one eye on the rearview mirror and the other scanning the road ahead.
Right.
You need both to be able to, navigate effectively.
So we've got to be looking back to understand the present and looking forward to anticipate the future.
Exactly. And none of this works if there isn't clear communication between the people who are gathering and analyzing the information and those who are making the decisions.
Right.
We keep coming back to this idea of communication and collaboration, but it's really the foundation for everything.
Because if the decision makers don't trust the information, it's useless.
Right.
That trust comes from transparency, open communication.
Absolutely. And Ardila Castro actually, he offers some concrete advice on how to improve that communication and collaboration.
Okay, like what?
He suggests, clearly defining roles,
Okay.
responsibilities for both the intelligence producers and the decision makers who are going to be using that intel. And that includes being really upfront about like what kind of information will be shared, how it will be presented, and when they can expect it.
So setting those expectations right from the get-go.
Yes, and it also means making sure there are regular channels for communication.
Right.
Things like briefings, meetings, written reports. But something that often gets overlooked is the importance of fostering relationships between the people involved. Oh, that's interesting.
If you have that personal connection, it's easier to build trust.
Makes those difficult conversations a little less daunting.
It's about remembering there are people behind all this, people who are working together to solve these really complex problems.
Humanizing it.
Exactly. Ardila Castro also recommends creating opportunities for joint training and exercises.
Yep.
That way everyone's on the same page, they understand each other's roles, and they can work on those collaborative skills.
So it's about fostering teamwork and understanding the whole intelligence process as a team.
Yeah.
Does he talk about accountability at all, like making sure the intelligence is accurate and it's being used effectively?
He does. He really stresses how important it is to create ways to give feedback and hold people accountable. Decision makers need to be regularly telling intelligence professionals how good the information is, if it's useful, and intelligence professionals need to be accountable for the accuracy of their assessments and, getting them done on time.
So there needs to be checks and balances. Exactly. You have to have systems in place, but it also comes down to the people involved.
Yeah.
I mean, we can have all the fancy technology and systems in the world, but without the right people, with the right skills, the right mindset, it's pointless.
That's what I was thinking. All this talk about systems and processes, but the human element is really what makes it all work.
That's a really key takeaway from Ardila Castro's work. He emphasizes that intelligence, it's a human endeavor,
Right.
which means it will always be prone to human error.
So it's not just about building systems, it's about creating a culture of excellence.
Exactly. That means encouraging people to think critically, fostering a culture of curiosity, making sure people are acting ethically. It means attracting and keeping the best people and giving them the tools and support they need.
So we're investing in the people as much as we invest in the technology.
Exactly. And it's about creating a work environment where people are encouraged to be creative and come up with new ideas.
Right.
Intelligence professionals need to feel like they can challenge assumptions, think outside the box, come up with new ways to solve problems.
They need to feel safe, taking risks, and learning from their mistakes.
Yes. And that includes creating a culture where everyone feels included.
Right.
The intelligence community needs to reflect the society it serves.
Absolutely.
Having all those different perspectives just leads to better analysis and better decisions.
It's about recognizing that diversity makes the whole system stronger.
It really does. And it's about breaking down those silos that we so often see in big organizations,
Yeah.
promoting collaboration and sharing information, both within and between agencies.
So moving away from that need-to-know mentality
Right.
towards a more open and collaborative approach
Yeah.
where everyone's working towards the same goals.
That's what we're aiming for. And it also means building stronger partnerships,
Okay.
not just with other intelligence agencies, but with the private sector and with foreign intelligence services as well.
It takes a village.
Because the challenges we face today, they're increasingly global.
Right.
No single country can handle them alone.
We're all in this together.
Exactly. By embracing these principles, we can create a more effective intelligence community, one that can handle the complexities of today's world.
This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I feel like I have a much better understanding of how this all works and just how many different factors contribute to these strategic surprises.
It is a complex field.
It really is.
Oh.
But before we wrap up, I'd like to talk a little bit about the author of the article we've been discussing, Carlos Alberto Ardila Castro.
Yeah, his background and expertise are really valuable to this conversation.
Absolutely. For our listeners who might not be familiar with his work, can you tell us a bit more about who he is and what makes his insights so important.
Sure. So Carlos Alberto Ardila Castro, he's a lieutenant colonel in the Colombian Army.
Okay.
And he's got over 20 years of experience. He's spent his whole career studying intelligence and strategic thinking.
So he knows what he's talking about.
He does. He's a consultant for national and international institutions and a professor at military institutions as well.
Wow, so he's not just a practitioner, he's also a scholar.
Right. He's got both the practical experience and the theoretical knowledge.
That's impressive.
And he directed the master's program at the Army Intelligence School.
Oh, wow.
He's also a published author and researcher, a regular contributor to GeoD's magazine, which focuses on geopolitics, defense, and security.
Okay.
And he's a researcher for Colciencias, which is Colombia's administrative department for science, technology, and innovation.
So he's a real thought leader in the field.
He is. His work is especially relevant to our discussion because he's so focused on the practical challenges and the need for agencies to keep up with the changing world.
He's offering real solutions, not just talking about abstract ideas.
Exactly. And that's what makes his work so valuable. He connects the theory and the practice. He gives insights that people can actually use to improve their work.
Well, it's been really great to dig into his article.
Me too.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
It's a good reminder that this work is complex.
It is.
Intelligence is essential for national security, but it's so hard to get right.
It is.
But, you know, by understanding those pitfalls and by really embracing those principles of continuous learning, adaptation, and collaboration, we can build a stronger and more effective intelligence community, one that's ready for whatever comes next.
We've talked a lot about how intelligence works or doesn't at the organizational level.
Right.
But for this last part of our deep dive, I want to kind of shift gears and bring it back to you, the listener.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, we're all drowning in information these days.
It's true.
It's everywhere. Social media, news, podcasts. So how can we, as individuals, become more savvy about the information we're consuming? How can we avoid falling into these cognitive bias traps that we've been talking about?
That's such a good question, and it's so relevant right now. I mean, we are just bombarded with information constantly. Yeah. I think one of the most important things you can do is to really become aware of your own biases.
Okay.
We all have them, whether we realize it or not.
Right.
They're those mental shortcuts our brains use to kind of make sense of the world.
Right.
But they can really lead us astray.
Yeah, they're like blind spots in our thinking.
Yeah.
We just gravitate to information that fits with what we already believe, and we dismiss anything that challenges that.
And think about confirmation bias in the context of intelligence analysis. It's not just about liking news that agrees with you. It could be like an analyst downplaying signs of an attack because they're expecting a diplomatic solution. They're making the facts fit their own story.
Oh, that's a good example. So how do we combat that? How do we become more critical thinkers?
You have to question everything.
Okay.
Don't just take things at face value. Ask yourself, who's giving me this information?
Right.
What's their agenda? Are they credible? Do they have a history of bias? It's like, you know, you would check an expert's credentials before taking their advice.
And it's not just about the facts themselves, it's about how they're presented too, right?
Exactly. The context matters.
Yeah.
Is it being presented objectively? Or is it spun to fit a particular narrative?
Yeah.
Is it meant to make you feel a certain way, like fear or outrage or excitement?
Right.
Paying attention to how the information is framed can tell you a lot about the motivations behind it.
So, okay, be aware of our own biases, check the source, and pay attention to how it's presented.
Yeah.
Those are some good things to keep in mind. What else can we do to improve our critical thinking skills?
You have to actively seek out different points of view.
Okay.
Don't get stuck in an echo chamber. Make an effort to engage with things that challenge what you believe.
So get out of our comfort zones.
Oh.
Be open to the possibility that we could be wrong.
Yes. And this goes back to that idea of unlearning.
Okay, yeah.
Be willing to let go of old beliefs if the evidence says you should. And if something sounds too good to be true,
Yeah.
especially if it fits your biases perfectly, be skeptical.
Like the old saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
That applies to information too. Healthy skepticism, it's a key part of becoming a more discerning consumer of information. And, you know, it's okay to admit you're wrong sometimes. We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them and are willing to change our minds when we see new evidence.
That takes humility, though.
It does. But intellectual humility is so important if you want to grow.
Right.
And remember, Critical thinking, it's a skill. And just like any other skill, it takes time and practice to get good at it.
Yeah.
The more you do it, the better you'll get at spotting those biases in yourself and others.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
It is, but it's a journey worth taking. Because by being more careful about the information we consume, we can have better conversations, make better decisions, and be more informed citizens.
I love that. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a few questions to think about. What assumptions are you making about the world? Where do you get your information? And how can you become a more critical thinker, a more responsible consumer of information? Keep those questions in mind, and until next time, happy deep diving.